We're going to start here with a little biography of oxygen, O2, the gas that we depend on so heavily, literally with every breath, and that figured so significantly in the previous videos on mitochondria and oxidative phosphorylation. First, it's interesting to note that O2 has not always been part of the atmosphere. Prior to around 2.5 billion years ago, BYA means billion years ago, with the origin of photosynthetic prokaryotes like the cyanobacteria. Before this, the Earth's atmosphere had no oxygen. Oxygen is produced by photosynthetic green cells, and we'll talk about this later on. Now, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and therefore, for the first 2.1 billion years, there was no O2. Photosynthesis must have evolved not too long before the first noticeable appearance of oxygen in the evidence left by the Earth's geologic record. Starting from the state of no oxygen 2.5 billion years ago, and then trickling in O2 as a result of photosynthesis by the planet's microbial life, it must have taken a really long time before there was any appreciable amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Initially, most of the oxygen was removed immediately by reacting with iron, and one of the reasons we know that oxygen wasn't around before this time is that iron oxide, or as you know it, rust, wasn't around in mineral deposits dating from before 2.5 billion years ago. The evolution of aerobic metabolism that we described in the previous videos, it must have occurred well after the evolution of photosynthesis. That is, after oxygen was first introduced into the Earth's atmosphere. Before this time, there would have been no use for a Krebs cycle or oxidative phosphorylation. There was, however, a long history of life before the origin of oxygen, in which all living cells would have had to have been anaerobic, meaning that they would get all of their ATP energy through non-oxygen dependent fueling reactions, like glycolysis. There are a lot of anaerobic organisms still around today. The yeasts that we use to bake bread and ferment fruit juice into wine and digested barley juice into beer are good examples of anaerobic organisms. They get all of their ATP energy from the glycolytic conversion of glucose into two molecules of pyruvic acid. These leftover pyruvic acids undergo fermentation, resulting in the production of ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide, the intoxicating stuff of alcoholic drinks, as well as the bubbles that are sometimes captured to make beverages like beer or champagne fizzy. It's the same carbon dioxide that inflates in the tiny spaces within the dough to make bread light and airy. In addition to yeasts, there are a lot of bacteria and archaea, as well as several types of eukaryotic organisms that are totally incapable of using oxygen for ATP synthesis. We generally refer to such cells as anaerobes, while the cells that do use the oxygen are aerobes. The initial introduction of oxygen into the atmosphere by photosynthetic cells about 2.5 billion years ago could also be thought of as enormously disastrous for most of the Earth's anaerobic life forms. Oxygen is a very powerful oxidizing agent, and it's for this reason that we can use it to peck away and degrade the food molecule fragments completely and extract all of the potential energy from them. A good question to ask at this point is, if oxygen is so destructive as an oxidizing agent, why doesn't it also degrade our cells' carbohydrates and proteins and other molecules? Or in other words, what's there to keep oxygen from pecking away at the organic molecules in our cells? In order to live in the presence of oxygen, like our cells do, we must have a pretty substantial set of defenses against the destructive effects of oxygen. When we're sold products that contain antioxidants, the main presumed benefits of these antioxidant chemicals is that they will enhance the natural defenses that we have against oxygen's harmful effects. Hydrogen peroxide, the stuff in the familiar brown bottle from the drugstore, is basically a solution containing the oxidizing destructive effects of oxygen. If you've ever applied hydrogen peroxide to a cut or other wound, You're familiar with one of our principal defenses. The bubbles that you see are actually made by the catalase enzymes of your cells. It's your enzymes that are breaking apart the peroxide before they can harm your proteins. Hydrogen peroxide is effective as an antibacterial agent because any infecting bacteria that might be there in the cut is probably far less protected against the oxygen as compared with your cells. Most kinds of dangerous bacteria would be immediately killed by the oxidizing effect of the hydrogen peroxide. Getting back to our history lesson now, at the time when photosynthetic bacteria were first releasing oxygen, none of the cells at the time, except for perhaps the photosynthetic bacteria themselves, would have been very well protected against oxygen's destructive effects. These photosynthetic guys would have been guilty of a global mass destruction of life through the release of this incredibly toxic gas. It was only after the introduction of oxygen that cells would have had any reason to use oxygen for aerobic metabolism in the way that we've seen in previous videos. Bacteria were the first cells capable of using oxygen's destructive potential to peck away at the glucose bits to derive more energy from the food. And it was only after we had aerobic bacterial cells that we could have had the evolution of eukaryotic cells with mitochondria, which themselves derive from these same aerobic bacteria that were among the first living things to use oxygen. Oxygen, O2, presently accounts for about 21% of the air that we breathe. And with only a couple of very bizarre exceptions, all animals are completely dependent on aerobic metabolism and therefore oxygen for meeting their ATP energy needs. We humans get our oxygen from the air, while most fish use oxygen that's dissolved in the water, though many fish are also able to use oxygen in the air. When the water's content of oxygen becomes too low, some fish will swim to the surface and gulp air and hold this pocket of air inside their bodies until their circulatory system can pick up some of the oxygen from the gulped air. In the next video, we're going to think about oxygen some more, but in a practical and far less historical way, as we look at how our bodies respond to physical activity. And I'll give you a hint. It's going to focus on the amount of oxygen that's needed and the amount of oxygen that we can provide.